everyone, and welcome. I'm so happy you're here with us today. I'm Julia Cutler, and I'm excited to be joined by best-selling author and leadership expert, Rob Cross. Welcome, Rob. We're happy to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
Great. I'll give some quick housekeeping information for our audience, and then we'll learn a little bit more about our guest. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please click the comments question button right below the video to submit your questions throughout the presentation. And as a reminder, the recording will be available tomorrow. Now, to properly introduce our guest, Rob Cross, co-author of The Microstress Effect: How Little Things Pile Up and Create Big Problems and What to Do About It, is a professor of global leadership and the co-founder and director of the Connected Commons, a consortium of more than 150 leading organizations. He has studied the underlying networks of relationships within effective organizations and the collaborative practices of high performers for more than 20 years, working with over 300 organizations and reaching thousands of leaders from the front line to the C-suite. He has identified specific ways to cultivate vibrant, effective networks at all levels of an organization and any career stage. He is also the author of Beyond Collaboration Overload: How to Work Smarter, Get Ahead, and Restore Your Well-Being. And before I turn it over to Rob, I'm going to just let everybody know that he has provided a couple worksheets that go along with today's webinar, and you can also find those in the resources right below the video. So go ahead and click on those. And Rob, I'll let you take it away from here.
All right, good deal. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody that's on the line. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some of the work we're doing at Institute for Corporate Productivity around the ideas of burnout more globally. So this was actually, turns out to be a book that I never thought I would write. I run the consortium that's focused very heavily on looking at networks and relationships analytically. And we have a range of programs going. It's about 150 organizations that are a part of it, where we have some very macro programs looking at organizational design or culture change or things like that. If you can map who's interacting with whom in large groups, whether it be a couple thousand up to 90, 100,000, you start to get a very different view of how work's occurring in modern organizations. And we've been doing that work and then looking at high performers in those networks for about a 5 or 6 year period, where across hundreds of organizations, where we're getting separate performance data. And it allowed us to go in and say, okay, what are high performers doing, right? How are these people in today's hyper-connected world successful? And so I'll never forget, I was sharing these ideas 5 or so years ago at one of our member meetings. So there was 200 or 300 companies in the room, and everybody was really excited about what we were finding about the more successful collaborators from a performance standpoint. Those people across a bunch of organizations that kind of got and stayed in that upwardly mobile category. And then somebody at the back of the room said, well, performance is great, but what about people that are just happier in their lives and work? You know, and can we think about those people that are thriving or experiencing higher, senses of well-being or things like that? And you have to be me at that time, right? Because at the time, all everybody cared about pre-COVID was innovation, right, and organic growth. And so we had a whole head of steam going around how do we apply these network ideas to looking at innovation differently. And yet somebody said, well, what about well-being? We'd like to lean into that as well. And so I remember thinking, oh no, that's going to be a whole different trajectory than where I wanted to take us. But I started doing these interviews and ultimately did 600 of them with 300 women, very successful women, 300 very successful men across these top organizations. And it completely changed my life and got in my soul to really be in deep conversations about the role of connectivity in people's lives today. And how many people are struggling, even these very successful people, because of the hyper-connected nature of not just our professional lives, but our personal lives, and some of the unintended consequences of that on how we experience well-being today. And as I was doing that, I also started focusing in on a lot of the other work out there, just became more and more aware to me or visible to me about a lot of other research that was going on that was showing how connections in our lives have a significant impact on the experiences of stress or burnout, or what Gallup was talking about in terms of the negative experience index has been going up for over a decade now. So I really want to emphasize this because this is consistent across a lot of studies. COVID has created a little bit of a spike maybe in terms of the burnout epidemic that's going on right now. But really what you're seeing is evidence of this over the past decade in most studies. And it's a product of the changes to organizations that have put us in these hyper-connected worlds in many ways. What Gallup was pointing to is the lack of quality connections has fallen off for people, the people we turn to kind of talk through difficult issues. And generally for many, it just boils down now to parents and significant others. And it's putting a lot of pressure on those relationships. I was finding also in my prior book, Collaborative Overload, that it was due to the volume, right, and the stress that creates in different ways. There's another book that came out by Vivek Murthy that's the current Surgeon General, who's the prior Surgeon General under President Obama and is back again. And he was focused on the lack of quality connections and the impact that has on our health, right? And so we're defining loneliness in the sense of not having people that you can turn to talk about important things, right? Or turn to for support in that way. And it turns out this has been going on for many, many years, really decades, that the quality of our community, of our connections has fallen off, despite being the most connected generation. Actually, the younger generations tend to actually experience greater instances of loneliness because of the quality of the connections. And the impact is phenomenal. You know, you go through all these public health studies and you find that the mortality rate of being in this category of clinically lonely is the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It increases risk of premature death by 26%. It's associated with heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, dementia. And as I was going through this, it really struck me, you know, why don't we pay more attention to the quality of the connections in our lives? Like, given the physical and mental health toll, why aren't we just more intentional about the way we cultivate and lean into connections in different ways? Because what amazed me as I thought about it is we will chase blood pressure medicines down to the end of the earth, cholesterol medications, all these things that we have the same impact as connections in our lives, on our health and our mental well-being. And yet we do very little to be intentional about how we're thinking about the role of the connections in our lives in terms of well-being. Yet we have so much ability to shape it. Right? Other work was showing that both the negative and positive benefits diffuse through these networks. And the really important piece of that was the negative interactions in our lives tend to have a disproportionate impact to the positive, right? So the negatives in general, over tons and tons of studies, tend to have about 3 to 5 times the impact of the positives. So thinking about not just investing in connections to create happiness, but also where the negative interactions are and how to shape them actually has disproportionate impact on our well-being. And then a great book, if people have not read it, The Good Life, came out as well. And it studied these Boston inner city students, right? And then Harvard graduates for 80 years, one of the most exhaustive studies on well-being or happiness out there. And they showed up at these people's houses. They interviewed them as technology has evolved. They do fMRI machines, blood tests, all this stuff, right, to see what is the drivers of happiness today. And the basic idea that they found is that the quality of the connections in people's lives was by far the biggest predictor of people's, happiness and satisfaction over time. And so, evidence just continued to pile up of the role of connections in people's lives and the importance of maintaining those in different ways to have a better life, right, experience. Yet the difficult part was most people's advice was coming back to you need a couple of close relationships, right? So you need a few best friends, right, or strong family relationships. And yet that can be a very difficult proposition, right, to get to. If you're just looking at getting a new best friend, for example, one study showed it takes about 200 hours to move somebody from acquaintance category to a BFF category. So that assumes you have 200 hours, and then you get lucky enough to pick somebody else that's going to give you their 200 hours, and it just isn't really feasible. Right. And so what we began to focus in on through all these interviews is not the relationship. And this is a subtle, but it's a really important distinguisher. Not how do you go get 2 best friends, right, or lean into just a couple of close connections, but rather how do we look at the interactions in all of our connections that creates well-being, and then think about where we can get those interactions, not just from best friends, but from other places, right? Because it opens up a sea of possibilities when we start to look at it that way. So the interviews I was doing, we really looked and said, what are the reasonable ways that connections in our lives are likely to have an impact on our well-being, right? And it boiled down to 4 likely ways from all the models of well-being. So we took away financial well-being and a couple of other things where there was a relationship, but it wasn't that strong. And when we looked at it that way, we could see that when people take better care of themselves, they tend to situate those activities that are promoting health in groups of other people, right? There's different ways that creates accountability and does other positive things for us. When people talk about purpose in their lives, we've gotten very convinced societally that purpose comes from the work or the mission of the organization, but actually about 50% of it gets generated in how we're interacting around the work or with others at home. And we can start to visualize that and think about how connections create purpose for us. How growth happens, both in and out of our profession, is intimately intertwined with the quality of the relationships, both at work and outside of work. And then how we experience resilience. Resilience is a great example to me of we are trained as a society to think of resilience as something we own, right? We have grit, we have fortitude, we have internal toughness. But if you ask 600 people about how they made it through a difficult stretch in their lives, and don't ask them what they did, right? How they heroically got through, but rather ask them, how did you fall back on other people? Not in a vague sense, but very specifically, what kinds of things did you get? You tend to hear 8 really specific benefits from having really strong networks that create resilience for us. So we can fall back on people for empathy, for sure, for the ability to see a path forward, people that have been in a difficult parenting situation or been in the new role that you're stepping into, people that give us perspective in life, right? That this difficult patch is in the context of life is not that big a deal. For me, it's humor. Right. And for a lot of people, it's the ability to just laugh at the absurdity of a situation. And what we could see is if you had built connections as you went through your professional and personal lives that created the opportunity to lean back on those relationships for these benefits, those people made it through much better. Right. We would hear tremendous setbacks, people whose spouse died from pancreatic cancer and they were left with 3 young children or things like that, that just fared much better. Right, as a product, not of what they did, not of their internal grit and fortitude, but as a product of the connections that were around them and knowing how to tap into them. So that's what we were doing, right, with the interviews. And give you a very first interview I was in, I just a lovely executive, life science executive in London, lovely British accent I won't try to emulate here. And I just got on the phone with her and I said, can you tell me about a time in your life when you were becoming more physically healthy? And not what did you do, right? But what was the role of the relationships in your life in terms of getting you into this activity, keeping you involved in it, whatever it may be. And she just kind of chuckled at me for a second. And she said, well, Rob, I was the person in high school that dodged gym at every chance I could, right? I wanted nothing to do with physical activity. And that worked for me because I love science and I was very much into my professional life after school up until about late 30s, where kind of the professional aspects of my life had gotten super stressful and intense, and my personal obligations, right, to family and others had really intensified. And she said her doctor pulled her aside in one of her, physicals and said, you have to do something about it. Right? If you don't work on your health and getting in better condition, you're going to have significant health problems mid 40s or later as you go. And that was a wake up call. And she said her response to that was that she started walking around a park outside of her flat in London. And because she would pick the same time each day, she ended up bumping into people doing the same thing, right? And they would strike up conversations. And eventually that became a group that started walking together. And then they walked a little bit further and then did a charity walk, and it evolved to a charity run. And till you flash forward 10 years when I was speaking with her, and she had become somebody that moved from being somebody that hated physical activity, wanted nothing to do with it, to somebody that would plan vacations with her significant other and some of these people where they would run a marathon first, right? And this is a very busy, successful executive, right, that had kind of built that into her life. And so it's a wonderful success story, right? And a fantastic example of, from her standpoint, about having identity as a runner helped her push back on work on the margin, right? Those last 5 emails would wait till tomorrow in the context of needing to get out and train for other objectives that she had in her life. But she said the real key to it was that she was suddenly in this group of very different people. And she wasn't hanging out with just life science executives that all saw the world and the troubles and the challenges and what they needed to do in the same way. Suddenly she was spending time with a cardiologist, a mailman, a mechanic, other people that saw her at her worst, and she saw them at their worst when they were pulling through in these different stretches of their training. And she said it was the perspective they brought and the dimensionality that came into her life that really helped her start to see and think about things, very differently. And that was one of the big core drivers of putting that activity with that group of people. And so you got to imagine this interview, my very first one. We're 45 minutes into a 90-minute interview. And I'm thinking, if I get 599 more of these, we got a New York Times bestseller here, right? And I stopped kind of midway, 45 minutes in, because this woman was funny. She was smart. She was charismatic. She was just, kind of really grounded in values in life. And it just hit me like, how in the world did you get in trouble? Right. And I asked her that. I mean, here's somebody that's at the top of their game, knows, what they should be doing to take care of themselves. How did you get to that point that a doctor had to tell you to take care of things or you're going to be in trouble? And this interview that was going 100 miles a minute went from, laughing, all sorts of energy, down to nothing like that. And she just looked at me and she said, finally, something like just life, I guess. And so we got super interested in that, because what she wasn't saying is it was one massive stressor, right? It wasn't taking care of aging parents, or it wasn't, a massive setback at work. What she was saying is it was the slow accumulation of the small things that had crept up around her. And we dug into that in the remaining 45 minutes, and with hundreds of interviews after that. And that's what we could very consistently see, is that that the stress that was really hurting people today, they certainly had the big things going on, but that wasn't what was crushing most people. It was the accumulation of the small, and they came in very specific forms that just tended to creep up around people if they weren't doing things about it. And so what we could see is that on a positive front, having the right connections in your life really matters, right? And so I can introduce you to one of my super positive sources of purpose and resilience in my life. This is my daughter, Rachel. She's 23, going to 24, just about to go into med school as a college athlete. Just, super wonderful source of inspiration and perspective to me in different ways. She is a sounding board to live more intentionally and kind of think about how I'm living my life versus giving, too much of my life to work. Daily source of laughter, right? She calls me Baldy and has all of her friends calling me Baldy, which if you're seeing the video, you'll understand that immediately. And so in so many subtle ways, even though, we're mainly virtually connected now, except when she comes to see me, it's just a source of inspiration and purpose, right, in my life. And these turn out to be really critical relationships to have. But what we were discovering is we all also have these microstressors, right? The people in our lives that create stress in small moments, not toxic stress, not huge moments, but small moments of stress. And so to give you a sense of who one of my greatest microstresses are in stark contrast, it turns out to be this person that I just introduced you to. It's, my daughter, Rachel. On a daily basis, Rachel is a constant source of worry about her future, right? Not fight or flight worry, but just wondering, is she taking the steps she needs? Is she being treated fairly? Is she going to be okay? She's a time drain with unexpected surges of stuff that she needs help with. It used to be school related or travel related for her sport. And now it's, medical forms for insurance. And how do I think about retirement plans and, all these other things. And one of the funniest things through all these interviews is parents would describe what they call parent homework, right? Where their children would be sent home with assignments late on a day, Friday, that had to be due Monday, that there's no possible way that child was going to finish that without 8 hours of help from the parent, right? And so, I'd get that, right, from Rachel. And then a source of secondary stress that magnifies from her to me. And one of the funnier things that she and I discovered is Rachel was a very high-end tennis player. In the United States, and she actually competed internationally too. And I would support her in many ways as I could. Knew nothing about tennis. I would chase her around the country, try to set up everything she needed to be successful as she could be with her physical skills. And because of that, we got into this habit when we were in different tournaments around the country, where she would come to me with anything that wasn't working well. Right? Baldy, this didn't go right, or Baldy, I need this, or Baldy this, Baldy that, and it just had fallen into our pattern, right, of how we kind of navigated this. It made sense at that point of her life. The problem is that same behavior had migrated forward to where this very successful 23, 24-year-old, anytime something went wrong, she'd fire off a text to me, I'm annoyed, right? Or I can't believe this, or whatever. And what we discovered this night in this restaurant in Cambridge over a glass of wine was that she didn't care about those things, right? So she would send them on just as a knee-jerk reaction, 5-second thought. To me, I would get them though, and I would worry about them for 3 or 4 hours. right? Not fight or flight worry, but just in the back of my mind, along with everything else going, how am I going to take care of this? What do I need to do? And so we just started laughing about it. And I said, well, Rach, if it doesn't matter to you, don't send it to me. When stuff does matter, send it for sure. But all these things that don't really matter, and there's just a knee-jerk reaction, push those to the side. And she's done that, right? And it's had a huge impact on my well-being. If I think about just a couple of these each week, sometimes 4 or 5 of these I would get, then I'm like, is she okay? And it's actually strengthened the relationship in the sense that when something is needed, I know it when I get it from her, and I'm on it very quickly. And if you start looking at things this way, and this is the real kind of thesis of where we're going with this, not the relationship. A lot of times people find stressful relationships in their lives and they say, I just need a distance from that person. Right? I need to get away from that relationship. But you focus on the interaction in this case and say, you know what? We discovered that there's an asymmetry in how we're experiencing these moments, and that you don't really need to or even want to pass them on to me. It has a really significant effect in our abilities to shape our context. In fact, when you start looking at it this way, we seize of opportunities to shape kind of what we do and who we're doing it with that can have a really significant impact on our lives. And so that's what we found across these hundreds of interviews, is that people were really struggling with this idea of microstress. So there's small moments of stress triggered by people in our professional and personal lives that are just so routine that we don't think about it. Right? It's getting the note from Rachel. It goes in the back of the mind. It's seeing misalignment with colleagues and wondering how you're going to solve that. And it's coming at us, importantly, through people in our personal and professional lives. So it's very different than disassociated stress. I mean, we have all of that going on: the economy, the war in the Ukraine, social justice issues. This is stressful because it's coming at us through people we know and care about. And if it happens to be coming at me from somebody that I dislike or I'm frustrated with because they're not coming through on things, it spikes me even more, right? Because I'm irritated. If it comes at me from somebody I love, it's even worse, right? And that was one of the big eye openers about microstress, is it wasn't just conflictual moments, right? Or toxic relationships. In fact, a tremendous amount of it was coming at us through people that we love and care about. And what we found when we look at this is there tended to be interactions in people's lives that created stress because they drained our personal capacity to get done what we needed to get done, right? And so this might take the form of dealing with a boss, changing strategic direction. You've invested an amount of time, maybe got other people behind a certain trajectory of work you're doing, and suddenly all that becomes moot, or useless. And maybe they even do that over a curt email where you're wondering, is this something I did? Should I have, other worries going on here because of the intent behind the email? Maybe it's just because we're moving between back-to-back 30-minute meetings. Pre-pandemic, people would complain to me. They would say, Rob, I can't get anything done. I've got 8 one-hour meetings. I can't get anything done until I get home. And if they had children are in bed, and my life is really jammed. And what's crazy to me is, as we went through the pandemic, somebody came up with a great idea that let's go to 30 or 25-minute meetings, right? And now we have 16 30-minute meetings in our calendars, not 8 one-hour meetings. And it's even worse, right? Because we're more intense in those small bursts of time. We're switching across these interactions more quickly, which is cognitively demanding and creates stress. And we tend to end the days not with a to-do list based on 8 meetings, but on 16 meetings now. And we can see people are working 5 to 8 hours more a week, earlier into the morning, deeper into the night. And it's a product of, this just doing the same thing faster that's creating it. Maybe email, right? That's overwhelming. And because people use it inappropriately, you're responding late at night to 10-paragraph emails where people are hiding what they want in the ninth. Maybe sorting out confusion of roles on a new project and trying to understand who's going to do what. And it can come from external sources too, right? Checking in on an ill parent as a part-time caregiver amongst all the other demands that people have in their lives. So sets of these, none of these are fight or flight, right? They're not huge crises moments. They're just slowly chipping away at kind of our ability to get done what we need to get done, and it creates stress. Then the second category had to do with things that hit us emotionally and just drained our energy, or the emotional reserves that we have at work. And that might take the form of conflict with a misaligned colleague, especially as we've moved more and more into cross-functional work. The opportunity for misalignment has skyrocketed And it creates all sorts of points where people are sensing misalignment in a call and wondering, how am I going to resolve that? How does our work fit together? How do we get that done? Maybe needing to deliver constructive but negative feedback to an employee, and wondering how you're going to do that and keep their engagement going forward. Holding space for another employee or teammate that's going through a difficult time, and maybe just the stress of trying to get home and be fully present, not just home, but fully present for a dinner with family. And maybe you miss it, right? Because too much is going on and you just couldn't get there in time, and you have secondhand stress from your partner that's frustrated with you, right? In different ways. Again, all these things kind of hit us emotionally, cause concern, anxiety, worry, whatever it may be. None of it's fight or flight, but it drains our ability to get through the day. And then the last set were what we call challenges to identity, right? And these are just slowly ways that we end up having to interact with others that are pushing us away from who we want to be. So we would see this in the form of like aggressive sales targets, pushing people to have to oversell, or cost-cutting goals that push people to have to treat other people in ways that they didn't want to. Or for physicians that were in our work, suddenly they've invested a huge amount in medical school and everything else, thinking they were going to be able to be present for patients in certain ways, and suddenly they aren't. Could be perceiving a slight by a competitive peer that undermines self-worth, or it may just be as simple as missing a child's bedtime, right? That just starts to challenge us from an identity standpoint, in the sense of, am I a good parent? Am I a good sibling? Am I a good friend? In different ways when I move these things. So none of these in isolation are big deals. In fact, you'd look at this and say, well, of course, right? All these you just get over. It's what successful people do. But it's the volume, the pace, and the velocity of them that surpassed what our minds were intended to do in our conventional ways of dealing with stress. And most of you on this call would look at this today and say, holy cow, that happened yesterday. Right? Maybe not this exact version, but this same kind of accumulation over time. And the problem with it from a neuroscience standpoint is that our brains aren't wired to register it, right? Unless we go into full fight or flight, our brains aren't very good at remembering specific things, and especially the volume of these things that are happening to us. And so they fall under the radar in a way that makes them, in some ways, legitimately invisible to us. We just don't think about them. But while the fight or flight response isn't invoked, and while the brain isn't necessarily registering them, our bodies do. Right? Our bodies don't treat this form of stress any differently than conventional forms of stress, where we feel overwhelmed, or we're stressed by an aggressive colleague, or whatever it may be. But our bodies absorb it. And so we're in this form of social stress. We tend to experience higher blood pressure, heart rates that are elevated, hormonal and metabolic challenges. In fact, some studies done at Northeastern University showed that metabolically, our bodies process food differently when we're under this form of social stress than when we're not. And so one study showed that if you had people eat the exact same meal from a caloric intake, in one instance, they had not been under this form of social stress for 2 hours. In another instance, they had been under this form of social stress within 2 hours. The people that were under the form of social stress added 104 calories to that meal. Right, metabolically, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you add that up, it goes to 11 pounds over the course of a year if that happened perpetually. So there's a lot of impact that's happening on our body, and most people get this immediately. Most of us, our heads hit the pillow at the end of the day and we're exhausted, but we can't quite put a finger on what just happened anymore. And it's not the big stressors, it's the accumulation of the small. And so if we just look at this, and I'm going to ask you now to start opening those 2 worksheets that I gave you. And I want to do something live with people here just to make this a little bit personal and give a sense of what we learned through all these interviews that the more successful people were doing. If we just look at, for example, the drain capacity ones, and I'm specific about the 5 that we saw there, it would be misalignment of roles and priorities among teams. That's happening a lot with cross-functional work, as I mentioned. Number 2, it could be lack of team member reliability. And by this, what we were seeing was not the big misses, right? It wasn't the colleague that just drops the ball completely. It's the fact that people in most organizations are put on 3, 4, 5, 6 efforts. They may have one home team, but usually they've been assigned to different task forces, committees, internal working groups, and most people, looking at the data, are on 5 or 6 of these. And what happens is everybody's doing this, right? Because leaders have just gotten used to throwing teams at everything and thinking, we can be agile in one firm with no cost whatsoever. And, if you own one of these initiatives, and let's say you have 4 other people on your team that need to get this work done, and those 4 show up to your work 95% done, right? So they're almost completed with what they had to do. Each is just a small miss, and they all make sense, right? Somebody's leader pulled them in a different direction. Somebody had a sick child. Somebody misunderstood. The other person's always a little bit of a flake. All reasonable stuff that you're used to. The problem is those small misses accumulate in our interconnected world today to you. So 4 times 5 people, 5% times 4 people means a 20% impact to you. And you're stuck with that decision of, do I work through the night and ignore things either in home life or other things that were keeping me healthy, or do I underdeliver? Right? Both of which create stress. And what we saw through all the interviews is most people choose to work through the night. And then what they've done is taught people that, okay, 95% was good enough. There may be 90% the next time. And I say that I really want to underscore, not believing that people are nefarious, but what I've definitely come to see through all these interviews is we have designed organizations where most people are trying to figure out which balls to drop, not how to excel. Right. And that means that these trade-offs are being made constantly. And if you're the outlet and you're not creating accountability, you'll tend to get, more and more of it. Third is unpredictable behavior from a person in authority. And that would take the form of shifting the what of the work, shifting performance expectations, quality or timelines, or just showing up emotionally differently, right, from point A to point B. Everybody's experienced that. Right. And most people go, oh, that stinks. What we often forget, though, is there are secondary impacts from a lot of these stressors. So maybe there's a big shift in expectations, and now you have to go back and protect your team and get them re-engaged. Or maybe if there's a big shift, you have gone out before on the certain trajectory you were on, and you enrolled certain colleagues from the company, and you said, gosh, if you'll help me here, I'll help you do this. And suddenly their effort to your work is meaningless, but you may still be stuck in providing your help to them, right? And what you kind of traded back. And that was kind of what we saw with these things. They all have an immediate impact, but all of them also tended to have secondary impacts, and some even tertiary, because again, of the way we're so hyper-connected in both our professional and personal lives. The volume, pace, and diversity of collaborative demands, that's gone up 50% or more in most work. It's not the work that's shot up anywhere nearly close to the collaborative footprint around the work that's gone up, that we're not managing well today. And then surges in responsibilities, and that can be at work or at home. So what I want to do, I want you to pull out that worksheet for me. And you have 2 of them. I want you to pull the one out that's focused on microstress. And I want to say, how do you make this actionable, right? Because what I don't want to leave you with is this notion that we're just in a sea of this stuff and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm actually super hopeful, because what we can see is about 10% of our population was living in a way where they were crushing the performance side of things, but also thriving in their personal lives. And a lot of it had to do with how they were intentional about the small moments of interaction with others. And I want to talk through a couple of ways to make that happen. So what you have here, right, as you're opening this up, because I want you to play along with me for a bit, is you have the microstresses listed down the left column here. And you have the most common sources of microstress across the top, right, in the column headers. Now, somebody on this call is inevitably going to say, what about me? I'm my biggest microstressor, right? And that I acknowledge that completely. But in this case, what we're focused on is the relationships, right? And so if you want to, you can add yourself as a column there too. But my main goal in this is to say, how do you change the interactions? And I want to take 3 passes through this with the time we have. I'm going to pause for 90 seconds for each one. But in the first pass, what I want you to do is look through these cells and say, where do you have a microstress that has become systemic enough that you should do something about it? Change the nature of the interaction, increase time between the interactions, put that interaction in a group of people that alters it, whatever it may be. I want you to look for 3, 4, maybe 5 of these and put an X in there. Now, some of you are off to the races already, and you may even have 10, 15 cells in here. And I don't want you to do that, because if it's everything, it's nothing. What I want you to do is just put an X in 3, 4, maybe 5, where there is the microstress is systemic enough that you should do something about it. And I'm going to pause for about 60 more seconds here to just create a little space to do this. And I would ask you not to jump back into your text or other things, but just take a moment to play along here with the time that we have. So I'll give you about 40 more seconds here. 3, 4, maybe 5, the interaction is systemic enough that you should do something about it. About 30 more seconds here. Okay. So now the book obviously goes into each of these, and there's tools associated with each. There's also a free app that I put up on the Apple Store called the Microstress Effect app that you can download if you want other specific ideas with the unique microstressors. But what I would urge you to think about is that idea I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. We know the negative interactions in our lives have 3 to 5 times the impact of the positives, right? And so just thinking about well-being as meditation or mindfulness or yoga, those are super effective things to do. And I wholeheartedly endorse them. But if you're not also thinking about how do I improve my well-being by removing the negative interactions that I can, you're leaving the highest leverage stuff on the table, right? 3 to 5 times the impact of the positive. And yet what most of us do is focus in on this, what connections do we lean into? How do we, persist through the system we've let build around you? If you shift the idea from I can't dump my boss to, well, you know what, I can actually interact with my boss in a way that takes some of these interactions down, you have a really, expanded opportunity set, right, of things that you can think about. So that's the first pass through, right? Just where 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe that you can actually see ways of shifting the interactions like I did with Rachel, right? Subtle shift. And what she was passing on to me, secondhand stress in this case, turned out to be fantastic, not just in taking my stress down, but actually improving in many ways the relationship, because I knew when something was significant, it was coming to me. Second pass through, I want you to say now, same thing, I'll give you 90 seconds starting now. And I want you to put an O in cells where you were unnecessarily creating stress for others, right? And that's a subjective idea. Stress is going to exist in different relationships. But here I want you to think about, where are you unnecessarily creating this for others? And push yourself to put an O in, 3, 4 cells in here. And I'm going to pause again for about 45 more seconds here. Okay, 30 more seconds. 2, 3, 4 places where you're unnecessarily creating stress. Okay. Now, a lot of times, if I have a little bit more time, we'll poll on these, and I'll ask, what stress are you experiencing, right? And what are the 3 stresses you want to do something about? And then I'll pivot very quickly, like I just did, and say, okay, what are you causing? And these, can be groups, several thousand people that are responding to the polls and the live webinars. And what's always interesting to me is the profile of the stresses people are experiencing tends to really mirror closely the profile to what they're passing on. Right. And so part of what we're trying to work through here is to say, how do you stop propagating stress unnecessarily, right? And creating these cultures where people are burning out. From a personal standpoint, what was incredibly clear to me through all these interviews is that the stress we unnecessarily cause inevitably boomerangs back on us in a different form. So maybe we, lean on a favorite teammate just 2 times too much, right? We keep going back to them because they're easy outlets for whatever we need help on. And we just go one step too far, right? And they start backing away. They get less creative, less willing to kind of be proactive and helping in different ways. And suddenly you're working harder and you can't quite figure out why. You don't put your finger on that. Or maybe if you happen to be a parent, right, you just push your child one step too hard on something that in the scope of life just doesn't matter, but you've gotten down in the weeds, right? And you're frustrated with something and you push one step too far, and you then start to reap the rewards of a child that's more belligerent, less willing to kind of proactively do things that you need done, or just a distancing in the relationship that creates stress. Regardless, what we can very clearly see is the less we unnecessarily create, the less we experience, right? And it's a heuristic you want to hold on to. And then the last pass that I want you to take through is say, where are you down in the weeds too much, right? Where have you just gotten locked into some dynamic with a teammate, maybe a client, a leader, whatever it may be, a loved one, sibling, especially, that you're just down in the weeds on. In the scope of things, it doesn't matter, but you've gotten so frustrated by the situation that you're magnifying, right, the stress. I want you to put a Y in those cells. Again, look for 2, 3, 4, where if you just took a little greater perspective and step back for a moment, you'd see that something wasn't worth the anxiety it's creating. And I'm going to give you about 40 more seconds for that. So Y in those cells where you're magnifying too much. About 20 more seconds. Okay. And this is this last point for me, and how you take perspective on situations and what you choose to get spun up about is probably the greatest differentiator of the happiest people that I saw in my interviews. So as we went through these interviews, they're all really successful people, right, in top organizations. So the very first 10 minutes of every 90-minute interview, it was rainbows and lollipops. Everything was great in life. And then you get down to minute 30 and you start to see the cracks come in. And minute 45, people are talking about the challenges of managing professionally. And then minute 60, it's like, oh my gosh, dealing with both personal and professional. And you get a real clear sense, right, of how much people are struggling. But what was fascinating to me is about 10% never did that. About 10% tended to stay positive throughout. And a big part of it was how they kept these micro stresses in perspective and didn't get pulled down into the weeds. And what we could see is those people generally had at least 2 and usually 3 groups they were an authentic part of outside of their profession. So like I was describing with my marathon runner earlier, it wasn't just the running. It was putting that running in that group of people that saw life differently, that created perspective, that enabled them not to get down in the weeds quite as much. The stories that ended really poorly, 65, sometimes older men and women that had allowed their life to become just about their profession and their direct family, almost always experience greater stress, right? Because everything rose or fell by just those couple of barometers. So when we looked at what I call my 10 percenters, right, those 10% that just never went negative, they tended to share 2 ideas. And I want to end on this and then turn to questions. One is that they were much more proactive in building their connections at work that pulled them into work they wanted to be doing. So much more likely to be planning 2 months out with interactions and seeding project possibilities, things that pulled them into work they wanted to be doing, and much more likely to be an authentic member of at least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of their profession. And the second thing is that they tended to live small moments more effectively. So what I could see is the 10 percenters, they may do big things like sail the ocean or write a concerto, but that wasn't what was creating the contentment and the happiness and the kind of, I'm in the right place in life. What was creating the contentment was living the small moments more authentically with others. And they did this much better, right? They were much better at isolating out the micro stresses and intentionally adapting them, intuitively or more through devices like we just went through. And then they tended to be much better at living authentic moments with others. And so this idea of having at least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of our work tends to be really important. And it's one of the things that's fallen off. We're experiencing greater levels of stress, number one, because the volume of microstress has gone up because of how hyper-connected we are coming through COVID. But at the same time, the social distancing pulled us out of those interactions in many cases that kept us sane, right? The book clubs, the running groups, the other athletic, endeavors. And if you're in that place, there's a second thing you can do, 3 ideas for kind of building dimensionality back in. One is reach back to a passion from the past and use that to slingshot yourself into a new group. So one of my favorite stories was a neurosurgeon that was in our interviews, and he was very austere, brilliant, top research institute in the country. And he'd gone through some interviews and then a program we did at that institute. And I didn't heard from him. And then about 4 or 5 months later, I got this email and the subject line said, "Rob, I've joined a rock band." And I just burst out laughing, because I was thinking, this very austere, very serious man. But what he was saying is he had realized that he'd allowed his life to become super unidimensional, right? And so his solution to that was go to a music store. He bought a guitar because he used to play guitar in high school and college, and he was going to bring music into his life as a way to get dimensionality. And as he was leaving, he passed by a flyer that said, we're looking for we're a rock band looking for a guitar player, and what we lack in quality, we make up for in volume or something like that. And he joined the band. He wrote them, said, I'd like to join. And when he was writing me, he said, "I'm having the time of my life. I'm hanging out with 20-year-olds, right? So they're never going to be my best friends. They're never going to be the 200-hour friends. But they're creating perspective and a distancing from work for me that has never made me happier, right? In different ways." And that's kind of what we would see, right? The people that have fallen out of groups, they can reach back to a passion from the past, use that to slingshot forward. They can reach back to relationships that have gone dormant. Easy thing to do is take 1 week, set up 7-8-minute phone calls with people you want to reconnect with and just say, "Look, I'm doing this experiment," right? Because it was written in the New York Times. And you'll have people laughing with you immediately. "You want 8 minutes? You sure you don't want 8.5?" But nobody puts an 8-minute phone call over the horizon. And when I did it, 6 of the 7 led to lunches, other things, right, that we're doing. And then the last thing is just to say, what are you already doing that if you just shifted slightly could pull you into either more of the professional aspects of your life that you like, the bubbles on the right, or the personal aspects. And I find that, again, that tends to be a really powerful way for people to say how small shifts, not big things, not go hike the Himalayas, push what's going to create purpose over the horizon, but how small shifts in what we're already doing that pull us into authentic connections can actually be much more possible than we sometimes think. So 5 takeaways, and then we'll wrap for questions here. One is adapt the negative. Don't just persist, right? Meditation, mindfulness, all that stuff is great. Definitely do it. But don't just persist in the system that you've allowed build around you. Look for ways to shift the negatives and get control of it. It has a disproportionate impact, 3 to 5 times the impact. Invest in dimensionality. If you have one idea you take away from this, make sure you're a part of at least 2 and preferably 3 groups outside your profession. Be present and provocative for your inner 5. So most of us have 5 people that we're super close to, and pick one every day that you just invest a little bit of time to keep those people being part of your group. Look for authenticity and repeat commitment to your top 15, and then look for ways to bring new relationships in. Right, that's one of the things that has caused a lot of rise in burnout today, is with COVID and the disruption of the interactions that created those closer connections. We haven't been making the investments to bring new people back in, right, or to discover different aspects of relationships that way. So that's it for me. I want to say thank you for the time to be able to share, some of this work. Super obviously passionate about it. You don't have 600 conversations at the level I got into without it really kind of touching your soul and thinking about what are, levers that we have to pull today. But I just want to thank everybody, and I am going to stop sharing here and turn things over to see if we have any questions or any things like that.
Yes, thanks, Rob. We do have questions, and we'll dive right in. Ashley has a question about the story you told about your daughter. She said, "It's great you were able to have that talk with your daughter about only sending important messages. How would you handle it with a more sensitive soul?" I don't want to give the impression I don't want to hear from them, but fear that's how they will take it.
Yeah, I think you have to obviously tease out what's right for each child without a doubt. So you had to be in that conversation. That was not a conversation of me saying, Rachel, you're killing me. That was a conversation of her laughing because she realized the effect it had on me laughing because of the absurdity of it. And that's what made that successful, right? And so I think you have to kind of tease that out a little bit. I would, so that's the first thing, right, is modulate to that. I found really what I found to be most effective for people is just being transparent about the impact in all this stuff, right, and being willing to kind of talk about it as one idea, right, and not, again, I really love that point about not saying I don't want to hear anything, right. In fact, many people here may say that would create stress for me. I want to hear more, but really to only hone in on if it's really small things in their world that are causing disproportionate stress in yours, and hone in on those as well. One of the funnier stories, the Financial Times reporter wrote a big column on this book when it came out, and I told him that story, and he said he went home and he told his daughter this, and she apparently was maybe not a sensitive soul, and she got right back in his face and said, "Do you have any idea how much stress you create around here when we're out of coffee?" And he was kind of laughing at how he got his own little bit of coaching in that moment too. So anyway, that would be just general thoughts there.
That's funny. We have a question from Mary. She says, I can identify the major source of microstress in my work life. How do you recommend handling it when the person causing the stress doesn't see it as a problem and doesn't see a need to make changes even after being asked?
Yeah. So for me, again, that's typically around creating transparency on the impact. And people are going to be differently receptive to that, depending on the way it's communicated, the history of the relationship, other things like that. But that's about the best advice I can offer, in that specific context. One of the strengths I often have is I've got these broad analytics too that I'm bringing to bear and saying, here's the ripple effect, right, of how your interactions not just hit one person but a number. And so that's the best advice that I have on that. Some of this will be not things you can take action on too, right? What I'm trying to get to with that grid is to really hone in on, gosh, there are 4, 5, 6 smaller things that I hadn't been thinking about. I'm just down in this one relationship because they're frustrating me, or it's just, real close part of my life. What I'm trying to create, and what we've gotten super good feedback from, is using that grid to be more systemic and seeing where there are pockets of opportunity that you can shift. So would, also urge thinking about that too with this.
Okay, thank you. Can you share some examples, a bit more on political maneuvering in system within the worksheet?
So we would hear that in terms of, people playing just games around who got invited to what meetings, or understanding, what was a priority in a given context. And so it takes different forms depending on the context, right, of what that might look like. Some of the stories you'd hear a lot about, for example, inside the company context, would be people jockeying for a certain pool of bonus dollars that they could give to their teams, right? And the politics that would come around that, and trying to take care of their team while simultaneously dealing with the politics of the situation. The other thing you hear a lot about is just outside of the work context, would be in different other organizations, community, religious, athletic, where there was just posturing for status that would start to create that form of stress. The book chapter on that, and then also the app, goes into pretty specific detail in a couple of tables that, if that's a piece of what you're struggling with, is certainly worth looking into there.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, another question from Anna. She said, everything you've said is like you read my diary or looked over my shoulder a few years back. And throw in menopause and midlife transitions, and she was a mess. I've worked my way out. I feel like I need to mark my gains and my growth. Is this a normal desire or response to overcoming such events, or am I overthinking it?
When you say mark, it's mark of the gains. Is that what you said?
I need to mark my gains and
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think so. Like, I think what I could see that was interesting, and I love how you said about transitions, as a piece of that, is so many people in my interviews, because these are long, right? And we're asking them about not just, their current station of life, but times in their lives. And what I could see is that many people, transitional points in life, they didn't handle expansively. And it created smaller and smaller versions of themselves as they went. So it would take the form of, I don't know, agreeing to stay home, right, and take care of children, taking a promotion. Like, it was equal, men or women experience this in very different ways, and I think in equal ways, but very differently. But maybe the promotion one I'll grab is, somebody would take a promotion or maybe even move their family to a different place. And suddenly what they don't think about is they've just uprooted, all these relationships that had been a source of community and purpose, right? For them in one context and then another. And most of them would come back, and say, gosh, I really have to focus on my job for the next 6 months. I've got to get good at this. I've got to get my hands around what I'm doing. And then I'll go back to life. And I would hear the same kind of thing on the parent side too. And what you found is a lot of times they never got back into the things that they were letting go of for 6 months, right? Either the tennis skills moved on and they couldn't get back into the groups they knew and cared about, or music had evolved in a way that they weren't able to keep in a chorus, or whatever it was. Right. And what you could see is progressively, a lot of these people just made decisions in the transition points that made them smaller and smaller versions of themselves. That wasn't good. Now, in contrast, what I would hear my 10 percenters talk about is they would go into a transition and say, this is the ideal time to shape everybody's expectations of me, right? Rather than me fall into their expectations of what I'm going to be doing, right? Just because that's what historically has been done or whatever. This is the ideal time for me to be shaping the nature of the work or the nature of my life outside of work in a way that's going to be more fulfilling. And they would actually expand, right, who they were as a product of that, more fulfilling work on one side, and they typically would not be giving up, and oftentimes added dimensionality in their life in the transitions that kind of, made them much, much happier and more successful. But so I definitely think, that the transitional points are super key things to be thinking about and aware of, either after you've gotten through it and you've kind of reset yourself and who you are. And even more so for me is if you can manage going into it with that mindset, right? Of how do I become a bigger version of myself and not get narrower? That tends to be an important lever to be thinking about.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Regina. Oftentimes we hear from individuals, especially in professional settings, that team members need to increase their emotional intelligence and deal with the very microstresses that you shared with us. What advice can you give to us when dealing with such personalities, and does any of this correlate to the level of emotional intelligence?
That's a really great question. So for me, I'm in a stage of research, and I've done this for 26 years in different ways, where we use the quantitative analytics to identify the role of these relationships on people's lives. So we can see the negative impact of the microstresses, and I can see the positive impact on that idea of dimensionality, right? At least 2 and usually 3. And then I'm going in and doing interviews, right, to really say, well, what is happening, right? What's creating these forms of stress? How do they manifest? What are 5 ways in each case that people get through this? Those sorts of things, sort of the qualitative parts. So I'm just now at the stage where we're developing instruments to start to kind of ask quantitatively, what's the relationship to different personality characteristics. So we'll certainly are looking at EI right now, but also a couple of other things like the big 5 and, for example, narcissism or even introverts. It's fascinating to me is when we look analytically, and I happen to be a strong introvert. People don't expect that from me because I'm on stages and everything, but you should see me on the plane when I leave that conference. Adrenaline crash. But what we know is the introverts don't tend to suffer inside companies. They tend to be just as connected as extroverts. They may be reaching less and sought more, but it's not a huge difference. It's on these things that they tend to falter. We do find the introverts tend to be less likely to initiate and stay in these groups that they need. And they don't need a huge amount, right? It's not about the volume, but it is a couple of close connections, a couple of things that create that dimensionality and that tends to fall off. So I'm just in the process right now of starting to really look at the correlation between different aspects of personality. I love the question I could see here on ethnicity, and gender. We just pulled down the Microstress Effect app. Has had tons and tons of people come through it, and we're able to play with a couple of these ideas there, right, and see what microstress are these different categories of people pulling. The other I'd throw on there too that I'm super interested in is the young generation versus my age, right, the older generation. I did a presentation for a bunch of CFOs a couple of weeks back, a big forum of CFOs, and one of the people pulled me aside and he said, the younger generation doesn't have stress. I looked at him like, really? And he said, well, yeah, they don't worry about work, right? They don't worry about delivering in the same way that, my generation did. And I said, yeah, that's true. They in general have a different perspective. I value that like crazy because I think I overdid work, right? And I'm looking at that. But I said, what they do have is social comparison stuff going on constantly that they're not handling well, right? We know from the analytics that our youngest generation right now is the most connected electronically and the most lonely statistically. And it's the quality of connections that are not there. Simultaneously, it's the stress created from social comparison, right? With all these apps that let us see what other people are doing. And so it's a big deal, right? To be kind of reflecting on the different categories of people in here as we progress, and probably the source of my next book. I'm either going to do that or I'm going to take these ideas into high schools and say, how do you equip kids earlier to be seeing this and dealing with it?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for your time this past hour. It was so informative and enlightening, and I'm sure that there are a lot of takeaways. And everybody, there's a link to Rob's book right below the video. You can click on there to grab a copy. And Rob, if people had more questions, can they find you on LinkedIn or email?
LinkedIn or robcross.org is the site. We have a book page set up. It's got a ton of videos and other things like that too. So that's a great resource to dig into. And I'm always looking to engage with people around the ideas that we're starting to write case studies and things like that. So certainly reach out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Rob, for your time.